Hello and welcome into the Ice Cold podcast for Second City Hockey of SB Nation. I'm Robert Zaglinski, joined by Adam Hess. You can follow me on Twitter at zigzags82, and you can follow Adam at Feathers in the Hat. This is the first really kind of edition that we're doing this, so it's sort of our pilot episode. So any technical errors or any production value that obviously probably go up as we go along. But we're trying this out, and hopefully you, the listener, enjoys this. Let's start off, obviously, with the 12-game winning streak. That's what everybody's talking about, the hottest team in the league. Adam, they just finished off the Predators last night. I mean, how is this team doing this?
I mean, in my opinion, it's all Corey Crawford. I mean, I shouldn't say all Corey Crawford. I mean, they got to score goals, but you look at Corey Crawford. His last 4 appearances, he has 3 games with 38 or more saves. Like, that's just absurd. That first of all, that even like that many shots are getting on goal with a team that's supposed to be this good defensively. Which a lot of that is score effects because they've been leading a lot. But at the same time, like you're letting up that many shots, and Crawford's just in position, controlling rebounds. Like his play just looks like solid all the way around. Every single save is confident, and he just looks like he controls that crease and commands it. And right now, I mean, I don't. His stats don't say he's the best, but I think this recent streak, I don't think there's a better goalie that's played better in their past, 9 or 10 games.
Are we? Yeah, I was gonna bring that up. Is he the best goalie in the Western Conference? Because we've seen people kind of talk about it on Twitter in the past few days. I'm not sure if I necessarily. I mean, Rene obviously with this bad hip and all, but Jonathan Quick is the Joe Flacco of hockey, which is really not that great. I have to give it to Crawford. I mean, essentially, given his past pedigree and resume as well.
Yeah, I don't think that you can name a goaltender where he's clearly better than Crawford, and definitely not this year. Maybe you can give it to a couple guys based on past resumes, but Crawford has 2 Stanley Cups now, 2 Jennings trophies, and playing for the best team in the NHL. That's not you can't just dismiss that play and say, oh well, he plays for the Blackhawks. Like you look at last year, I kind of wrote about this in that piece I wrote today, but like Crawford, like last year, the Hawks, after Kane went down, the Hawks like kind of played like shit for a couple months. There wasn't a lot of spark to them, and there were games that Crawford literally stole for them, and in a lot of ways, you could give him credit for them even making the playoffs. Not that they, when I remember hearing a quote from Patrick Sharp where he said, with 10 games left, they were like, "Wow, we might be on the outside of this," and Crawford willed them in, and they ended up winning the Stanley Cup. And he was, the playoff struggles were well documented and whatever with him in that first Nashville series. But after that, he was confident, came back, and he was consistent. And I just don't think, as much as Patrick Kane is having the best year in the NHL and is the league MVP, I think in a lot of ways Corey Crawford is basically like the number 2 MVP of the team. Like without Kane and Crawford, this team would be scoring a lot less, and it would be much less fun to watch. But without Crawford, this team would be in a much worse place.
Nice segue. I mean, you brought it up with Kane. That whole line, Panarin and Kane with their chemistry and Nisimov setting it up. I mean, they're the ones that have been doing it all year. We've really been counting on that line as the only necessary scoring the Hawks have had. But Brandon from our group from SCH, he told us to talk about how Shaw coming up on the top line with Taves and Hossa. I mean, that line has been on fire recently as well. Hossa 6 points in his last 6 games. Taves back to his scoring ways, 19 goals in the year now. Andrew Shaw actually looked like a competent player. I'm not sure if this is necessarily to trade him, but the offense certainly has much more depth than it had in October. Not as really shallow. I like what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, when you get, as soon as Taves and Hossa start rolling, it all goes downhill for the Hawks. Like that's where it starts, because, like you said, the Hawks were relying a lot on Kane and Panarin and Anisimov. But when you look at how like the struggles that Hossa and Taves were going through, it's like that you could point to a lot of the issues on the Hawks, and you can look right there and say, okay, that like if those two were producing, a lot of these things would probably be lesser of an issue, especially because when they're not producing, they press a lot more. And so their two-way game suffers a little bit. You can kind of see where when they're not playing as well offensively, they do kind of suffer a little bit defensively. And so them getting on that roll has been awesome. And, they were starting to click a little bit with Teuvo Teravainen. Things kind of shut down a little bit again. And so they got Shaw up there. And he kind of brings – the thing about Shaw, he's definitely not a first-line winger. And I don't think anyone in the NHL would ever suggest that Andrew Shaw should, in a vacuum, he's not going to be on that line. But he brings a crazy energy and just a net front presence that you almost need to have on that line with Taves and Hossa, that you never really realized it because, he's able to create that space in front of the net, create traffic, and just kind of raise some hell for the opponents and create that space for Taves and Hossa to do work.
You're giving him so many glowing compliments, and yet he's probably going to be traded in February, in all likelihood. I mean, putting him on the top line is the right idea if you want to do that, considering what he's been doing recently.
Right.
But we want to talk about the two kids too, Gustafsson and Denault. You mentioned Teuvo. Denault and Teuvo have been that dynamic duo on the third line, and Gustafsson has stabilized the D. Gustafsson's a stud. I mean, I've seen it's been 15 to 16 games, and he has lots of work on in his own end. But Gustafsson, I mean, he has some pretty good offensive instinct for a 23-year-old. It really goes to show you the shit Edmonton's been going through and their overall awful player development and system. Honestly, Gustafsson looks like our number 4 defenseman for a good while. I mean, pending the salary cap in Canadian dollar. And Denault is. I've seen people compare him to Dave Bolin, which he's probably a little more skilled than that, but that's a pretty valid comparison considering the awful neck beard too.
Yeah, I think. Well, to start with Goose, he's been a bit of a revelation in my opinion. I don't think when the signing was announced, it's one of those signings where you look at Stan Bowman. It's one of those signings that Stan Bowman makes, and you're thinking, okay, another guy that Stan Bowman signs, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, well, it's another Stan Bowman signing where it looks genius, as soon as the guy's in the NHL and succeeding. And Q has according to the beat writers, has fallen in love with him, and that's all great. And you're right, his offensive instincts have been great. In that game against Montreal this past weekend, where he took the puck, he had it in his zone, and then I think it was 5 seconds later, he's in the offensive zone, passing it off to Panik. His speed is crazy through the neutral zone. At times, I look at him and I'm almost like, how did this guy end up playing defense with how quick he is, his stick skill, his shot? What coach looked at him and thought, yeah, I want you on the blue line and not in between the dots? But at the same time, it's awesome to have that offensive instincts behind, be able to drive play from the back, especially in Q's system. The one thing that I'm a little worried about with him is Q loved Nick Leddy when he came up and gave him a lot of praise for a long time, and that turned pretty quickly. So, and you mentioned that Gus sometimes does kind of struggle in his own zone. So hopefully he can kind of continue to mature and get better, because it would suck to see this turn into a Leddy situation where we lose him and are looking for another one, in 2 years or 3 years.
Well, Nick Leddy hasn't exactly. If we're going to go off that track, Nick Leddy hasn't been great with the Isles recently. He's not playing on their top pair, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it'll necessarily be a bad thing if we lose Gustafsson. I mean, this team just churns out prospects, and Bowman, like you said, just finds diamonds in the rough everywhere. I'm not sure if that's too much of a concern.
Yeah, but I still think Leddy. He last year was probably one of the 15 or 20 best defensemen in the NHL. He had a great year. I remember seeing him on a couple people's Norris watched lists at the end of the year, which surprised even me, but that just speaks to the kind of season he had and the kind of, off the player he is. And I think in a lot of ways he has the potential. He's 24, so maybe it's the gap's kind of close. 24 or 25, maybe the gap's kind of closing, but I think he has a lot of the potential to become kind of a Duncan Keith, where he dominates both ends of the rink. But I guess my point with just the Leddy thing is, he's a very similar player, and he plays a very similar game, and it's fun to watch that happen. But that's how it was with Leddy at first, and Leddy was probably much worse in his defensive zone and didn't make as good defensive plays. And so I'm not really trying to knock Goose at all, But I guess what I'm saying is like, and maybe I'm looking too far ahead. I would hate to see it turn into that kind of thing because of how good he's been. I do want to see him stick around with the Blackhawks for a while because, like you said, he's only 23. He can be that number 4, possibly even move up to number 3 if necessary for the next 4 years.
If he's going to stick around a while, I mean, can we get a better nickname, Goose or Gus? He deserves better. Come on, Breadman. I mean, it's not exactly the most creative, but that there's some flavor there for Panarin and Taves, Captain Serious. I mean, come on. Can you think of something off the top of your head? I mean,
I like Goose just because I think the name's pronounced Gustafsson. It's kind of like
Gustafsson? Is it okay?
I think that's how it's supposed to be pronounced in Sweden. And so I think it's Gustafsson, and that's where they get Goose, kind of like with Rasmussen. His name is Rasmussen, I think, or Rasmussen or whatever, and they call him Moose. And so it's just kind of it's derived from his name, I believe. So I think that's where they got it because it's weird to say like Gooser or Gusser or whatever. So Gus or Goose is just kind of the name short. I think it serves as a nickname.
Or Richard Panik or Panic. No one's really sure how to say his name on the third or fourth line. The guy coming through the visa. Adam, what are we concerned about still with this team? I mean, you can't really be concerned much with the team that's vaulted themselves in the first place in the Central Division and Western Conference, 12-game winning streak. But there are obviously still some things. I mean, I'm looking at the defensive depth. If one of those top 4 guys goes down, if even Van Riemsdyk goes down in that third pair, then you have to play Skrozval more. Mm-hmm. You have to play Skrozval more often, and when those two are on the ice, more often than not, the Hawks are pinning their own end for a good portion of periods. The third and fourth line, maybe some scoring touch, maybe a little more skill there, maybe spread things out. I mean, what are you looking at?
I think I look at 2 things that are if I was Sam Bowman and I was looking to make a trade, I'd look for one of 2 players, or maybe even these 2 players. I'd look for one player to be a 5th defenseman that can be better than, or maybe that can be better than Rob Scuderi and Michael Roosevelt. Those 2 guys are serviceable. Scuderi is horrible, but he is at least
Scuderi's horse shit. All right, I mean he's beyond
bad, but at least he's not the worst option out there, but he's definitely not good. And then we could you don't really, he's not a guy you want on your team, but he's also a guy that's like, okay, whatever, I'll deal with it. Like, it's one of those things. But I think I would look for a defenseman to kind of shore up that back end, especially because Trevor Van Riemsdyk, he had a good start, but he's kind of slowed up a little bit. And at times, I've seen people just say like he doesn't even look like he belongs in the NHL. And sometimes I watch him and I'm like, gosh, I don't know that I entirely disagree. And I think that his play has kind of struggled. And then I would also look for a guy to be that legitimate third line left wing to go along with Danault and Teravainen, because those 2 guys have so much. They're so creative. They have such good vision. They're so skilled, but they have like Andrew Desjardins is a good player for a 4th line role, but when he's on that 3rd line when they're trying to score, I think sometimes he kind of can kill what they have going because he just can't match the skill and the pace that they can play at. And so I think you look for a guy to fill that role, and that can just bolster that 3rd line into becoming pretty much a very dangerous 3rd line, and you can really roll 3 good scoring lines and then a very solid checking line centered by Marcus Kruger when he returns for the playoffs.
So do they even need to make a trade for forwards? I mean, honestly, they could bring it Marco Dano, but he hasn't exactly been lighting it up in Rockford recently. People have been talking about it recently, and I think we should touch on it. Jonathan Drouin, play a possibility for the Hawks. He is suspended indefinitely by the Lightning because today he didn't he didn't show up for Syracuse's game, the AHL affiliate for the Lightning. But this is a former number 3 overall pick. This is arguably one of the more talented younger players in the league. John Cooper, for whatever reason, is pulling a Quenneville on him and not letting him hit the ice, considering all his potential and all his skill. Is this something realistic for the Hawks? I mean, his price certainly is going to go down if he's being suspended indefinitely by Tampa Bay. I mean, we can take this from any angle.
Yeah, I think I think that it's a possibility. I think it just depends on what the Hawks are willing to give up. I think so. You look at the players that Tampa Bay probably want in return for Druin, and I think three names. I think Teuvo Teravainen, Marco Dano, and Ville Poca. I would absolutely, under zero circumstances, trade Teuvo Teravainen for him because Teuvo's already had better success at the NHL level, fits in well with the team, and you can tell Q likes him and trusts him, and that trust is growing. And also, Teuvo plays the two-way game. Druin has maybe more offensive upside than Teuvo, but Teuvo's skill is it's undoubtable. You can't deny that Teuvo is crazy skilled, just like Druin is. And Teuvo plays the complete 200-foot game. Is very solid in his defensive zone, which the big knock on Druin is he's uninterested in defense. I think that if you're going to bring Druin in, you have to make sure Q will play him. But I think that I'd be willing to trade Poca or Dano, probably not both in one deal. But I'd be willing to trade one of them for Dano or for Druin. But it's just a fit of if Q's going to play him, and if he comes in, do you put him on the top line with Hossa and Taves, because that's a line that needs to play 200-foot game, needs to play defense. Can he fit in there? Or do you slot him in with Teuvo and Dano? I think if you slot him in with Teuvo and Dano, that line becomes an extremely dangerous line because Teuvo, that's a line that can kind of focus a little bit more on offense and doesn't have to have such a defensive load, which Q likes to do with that third line. And so you have that line that can do that, and then you still have Dano and Teuvo that can play that 200-foot game and kind of let Druin maybe kind of cherry pick a little bit, kind of hang out by the blue line, which you don't want him to be lazy, but you still can kind of maneuver and make him fit. But it's just a matter of, can you get Druin here? If you can't get Druin here and they still want to try with Dano, I think that he fits in well with Dano and Teuvo as well because he also kind of plays that defensive style game. But I don't think. I mean, like you said, Dano hasn't been lighting up the AHL. Last I checked, he hadn't really scored a lot since he's been down there again, and he's been being used in some weird ways by Ted Dent. And so I saw he had an assist the other day on a pretty nice play where he set up he set up Svedberg to set up someone else. I think it was Tanner Kiro. So it was a pretty slick play that they ran, but ultimately I don't know that Dano's really ready yet. He had a really strong season in Columbus last year, but Columbus also was just a much worse off team. And so it just depends on if you're going to see Dano. It depends on where they view Dano being at. And, I think it's sort of a Teuvo situation like last year where if a situation comes up, they'll probably give Dano a shot. But I think that if the possibility is there to get Druin, I don't know why Stan Bowman shouldn't pull the trigger, really.
See, I disagree with that statement of Dano being like Teuvo. Teuvo was a highly touted prospect. I saw some people really shocked that he fell in the 2011 draft. Was it 2011, 2012 draft? They were saying that he should have went over Galchenyuk, I believe, was also in the same draft. I mean, Dano was a low first-round pick, which is still pretty good for a prospect, but he's not exactly as highly touted. And I wouldn't really have a problem with giving him up for Steve Yzerman, who's gonna blow everything up, because let's be honest, they're gonna freaking lose Stamkos, and it's gonna be hilarious. But so they're looking back for every kind of prospects. But if we look at the actual asking price, it fits better for them to sort of for the Hawks to offer Poca and Shaw, a gritty forward and a right defenseman. We talked about this on Twitter. I don't know if I'm necessarily comfortable with the Hawks giving up another young defenseman. They've already traded Steven Johns. You mentioned TVR not exactly being NHL caliber, at least at the moment. This team needs defensive depth more than scoring depth, and if you have to do that to get Druin, I understand he's a number 3 overall pick. I understand the immense potential and what he could be in this league, but it could tremendously backfire. Maybe that's what a win now team does. Maybe they pull the trigger anyway. But I don't know. Dude, it's just scary to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is a precarious situation to be in. To have maybe the player that they would be most interested in be pretty much arguably your only real defensive prospect that has any NHL shot. But I think I think that the Blackhawks have found ways to replace players to keep the pipeline, as Satchel likes to call it, the pipeline strong and flowing. And Stan Bowman loves to bring in those. He loves the European signings, the college signings. They have some good. They still have some good defensemen that they've drafted in the past couple of years that they have some high hopes for, I believe. And they have Gustav Forsling, who was a stud in the World Juniors, and people were looking at him like, how did Vancouver let this guy go? The Hawks have him. He's a better prospect, not closer to the NHL, but probably a better defensive prospect in terms of potential than Poka. So I think that in some ways you're right. Like it is a little, it's a little dangerous, but I think that when you're getting a player of Drouin's caliber in return, if that trade is a possibility, then I don't see how. Like I think that the return outweighs the risk. And the ends kind of justify the means, where you bring in Drouin, and if you still have Marco Dano, like that's a piece right there that is now sort of the odd man out in terms of sitting in along Tavo and Drouin, and then also you have Andrew Shaw, who you can try to flip. He's an RFA this year, but you can try to flip him for a defenseman. You have tradable assets that you can try to turn into defensive prospects in the offseason for teams that are looking to add some pieces. So a guy like Andrew Shaw, who clearly, when given some responsibility, is able to demonstrate some scoring touch and brings good energy and grit to a team that is looking to compete. Maybe the Hawks can get to net a good defensive prospect out of that, or even just a half decent one with the potential to be a fourth defenseman. If that's all you get for Andrew Shaw, that's still a pretty good trade if you've ended up trading Poka for Drouin, because you still have Keith and Hjalmarsson and Seabrook locked up for the next 4 years at least, for those three, and Keith and Seabrook beyond that too. So the Hawks, as much as the prospect pipeline on the blue line is not necessarily as strong, the Hawks still have pretty much arguably the best three defenseman tandem, or not tandem, but three defenseman group in the NHL moving forward for the next couple of years.
And they do it, like you said, they do it with all this really close and tight to the cap. They almost have no room, but and I'm not sure if they have much maneuverability. Really, everything you said is everything they can do. And yet Stan Bowman and them are so good. I mean, what was it you meant? You wanted to share this? Your fiance? I mean, they're so good.
Oh yeah, she said they have the best players and the best coach and the best goalie, and they just have so much goodness. And
they just have so much goodness.
And I was thinking about that. I was like, that's so much goodness is a pretty good way to put it. Where they have arguably the best coach in NHL, second most winning coach ever now. Best player in the league right now, arguably the best goalie in the league right now, at least in the Western Conference. Like everything's clicking for them, and they have a front office that just gets it. And their scouting has been great. They've drafted players. Stan Bowman doesn't. I don't think he gets enough credit sometimes for
Stan Stink.
Exactly. I don't think he gets enough credit sometimes for how well he drafts and scouts, especially in Europe. You look at guys like Gustafsson, Panarin, Tavo, Dano, like all these guys that he's bringing in, like these are all very good to elite prospects and players, and they're all coming from Europe. Like their European scouting has been great. So the Hawks, I think that they're in a good situation, and so I think, I don't really know where I was going with that, but
circling back, where do we think Drouin ends up? I'm partial to the Habs, who are in a free fall, which is also hilarious. They'd be dumb enough, considering they'd be dumb enough to certainly give up Galchenyuk or any of the other, or Gallagher, whoever, for Drouin and a couple picks. I think he ends up in Montreal. I mean, that's what's been teased the past few days as well, and they're going to be desperate to make it, to try to maximize price and whatever cup hopes they misguidedly think they have.
Gosh, my gut kind of tells me that Tampa won't trade him this year. which it might sound really dumb, and I'll probably
That's
end up
stretch,
being.
man. Come on, that's a stretch.
I probably won't end up. I'll probably end up being wrong on that, but I think that I don't think. I think Tampa is gonna Steve Yzerman. You hear I see it all the time on Twitter. If you think Steve Yzerman is gonna be pushed around by this, if you think Steve Yzerman is gonna be pushed around by this, Steve Yzerman is gonna have a price point for Druin, and he's not gonna back off that, and he's going to want to maybe package some salary to still keep a hope and a prayer of re-signing Stamkos. So I think he's gonna have this what he wants. I don't think he's gonna settle very much. I think if I had to venture a guess. I think that I hope it doesn't happen, but my guess would be the Blues because they seem to be very interested in him, and they're willing to trade Robbie Fabry, which is probably the most attractive offer that
and Shattenkirk.
Tampa Bay will get.
And
they could trade.
Which would be hilarious.
They could trade Shattenkirk as well, but I don't. I think Shattenkirk. I was reading this the other day. I think it was Elliot Friedman's 30 Thoughts where Shattenkirk is a little more unrealistic due to cap hit because Tampa Bay is just a cap-stricken team, just like the Blackhawks. So maybe it's not as realistic, but if they could get Shattenkirk and Fabry for Druin, which I think if that's a trade right there, I would laugh at the Blues because they would be losing that trade horribly. But if they can, Fabry and or Shattenkirk is probably the best offer that Tampa will see, and so I think that my guess would be that the Blues get him if I had to guess one.
In our like all of our spitballing and BSing, we also touched on sort of where we think Stamkos ends up. Do you think Stamkos gets traded before the deadline, or does Tampa play it out and let him, in all likelihood, leave to Toronto? Since we're on Tampa.
Yeah, I think that it would depend on it if they trade Druin and what they get for him. So if they traded Druin for Robbie Fabry, that's a little bit more of a future-minded move. Or if they got him or if they traded Druin for if he went to Montreal and they maybe got Alex Galchenyuk. Okay, Alex Galchenyuk's a guy that now can sort of fill in that pseudo number one center role, and they can groom him to be that for the next couple of years. So then I think I can see them trading Stamkos, but ultimately I think that they're going to want to try to go for it this year because they still have a good team. And they can improve their team by trading Druin if they trade him. And so I think that they're going to try to go for it. So I don't think they'll trade Stamkos. And I don't think they'll trade Stamkos because, not that I have like inside information, but what I've kind of been reading. It's
yes, you do. Come on.
I don't. I have no sources or anything. But from what I've been reading, I think it was I don't remember what Twitter person it was the other day, but someone said that the talks between the Lightning and Stamkos are still going on, and it's not like they're not going anywhere. Like they're still negotiating, they're still kind of ballparking, figuring it out. It's not like both sides have given up. And Elliot Friedman has said repeatedly that he believes that Stamkos's main desire is to stay in Tampa Bay. So I can still see where they still hold out hope that he'll re-sign there and that they won't lose him. And so maybe he will end up staying with Tampa Bay. So I don't know that they'll trade him this year.
Well, if they could get Galchenyuk and then have him actually play center, unlike the asinine Michel Therrien, that'd actually be a win-win for them. I mean, I'm not sure.
Right. For sure. If you're giving up Druin to get Galchenyuk, and then you think, and if they then start to think, okay, we have Galchenyuk in fold, they have Tyler Johnson still, who's could possibly again be the number one center for the time being. Yeah, they have all those guys that can play center and play it well. That if they started to get thinking that, oh no, we're not going to get Stamkos, then flip him for whatever you can get. There are teams out there that can get him. I think I asked the SB Nation Roundtable a couple weeks ago what they thought about Nashville's chances of getting Stamkos, because Nashville is a team. I mean, if you look at it, I don't know that there's a team that really makes any more sense for to be in on the Stamkos trade. You could say Toronto, but they're probably going to try to get him in free agency. Nashville's a team to me that they're sort of on the outside right now, but if they added Stamkos, then all of a sudden they have Stamkos and Johansson and Mike Ribeiro and Mike Fisher, who are all, Stamkos and Johansson are both number one centers. Ribeiro's, a decent he's a shitbag human being, but
He's a shitbag.
Yeah, he's a decent offensive hockey player, and they're adding Stamkos to again to the likes of Johansson, James Neal, Philip Forsberg. So if they could trade a good prospect, they have a lot of defense too. They still have a lot of defense in that pipeline. So maybe they trade maybe Ryan Ellis and a first-round pick. That might be handicapping them a little bit more on the defensive
Ellis
side.
Ellis in a first-round pick isn't going to get you Stamkos. Come on, Ellis in a first-round pick is not.
Well, and something else. But yeah, regardless, if they're willing to start there, maybe they end up getting Stamkos, and I think it makes sense. That's a team that I can see getting in. But we're sort of digressing here, where I think that if my point is just I don't think the Lightning will trade Stamkos, and I think that they would only do it if they traded Drouin for Galchenyuk.
Either way, we sent out a flyer for Twitter questions. We didn't get much of a response. Hopefully, as this grows along, we'll actually get some input. But we did have one. At Shide BDM, Brendan wanted us to recklessly speculate irresponsibly on why Brian Bickle struggles, why he's been demoted, why he's basically useless. I mean, I'm sure he's a decent guy, right? All that
Right.
crap. Basically, Brian Bickle's a person that won't be traded. Adam, I don't know. Brian Bickle, for me, I've seen this opinion in the past few days, and I have to agree with it. I mean, he's definitely seems like a nice guy. He definitely seems like he has everything together, and he's a good teammate. But this is the professional league. This is the best hockey league in the world. You're playing for the best organization, the defending champion. You really can't drag yourself around for 5 to 10 minutes a night doing nothing, having no role, and then throw your own pity party. I don't know. Bickle, they're not good. I feel like they're never going to be able to trade him, and it's killing me. But I don't feel bad for him. I'm not pitying him at all. I don't know what's wrong with him because his agent also said that it wasn't vertigo originally when he had those issues back in the during the Western Conference Finals and Stanley Cup.
The ocular issue or whatever.
It was an ocular issue, so he can't see. So I don't know what's wrong with him. I mean, he did have bad knees in the past, so maybe he can't move as well. Maybe he's not as confident. But I'm not going to make any excuses for him, and I'm not going to pity him. And I guess that's my reckless irresponsibility.
I would say my reckless irresponsibility is that Brian Bickle never was a good hockey player. Never was worth the $4 million contract he got. He lucked into it by happening to be, pretty much probably the best player, one of the best players in the Hawks 2013 Cup run. If he hadn't had that run, he probably gets maybe a $2 million contract, which if he's in here at $2 million, it's not as big of a deal. It's not a horrible anchor contract. You know what I mean? It's not as egregious. But when it's $4 million and it's taking up, almost 10% of a cap, because the cap, or not 10%, but almost 5% of your cap alone, then that is a difficult place to be as the Blackhawks, and that puts them in a tough spot. And I just don't think he was ever a good enough hockey player to warrant the contract he got, and he lucked into it. And so, yeah, he is just bad. And I write for this paper in Rockford. I write a weekly column there, and I wrote about, my column this week was about Bickle and about how, like, the Hawks are in a lose-lose situation with him, where, like you said, they're probably not going to trade him. They're like, there's not a team in the NHL that is going to take him in the middle of the season. So maybe over summer you get some desperate team who's looking to reach the cap floor. Then the only team that I can really even think of that would be willing to do it off the top of my head is Toronto, and I don't think that they're gonna be signing free agents, not trading for expensive contracts.
They're doing that now. Babcock's doing it now. They're putting shit on the ice and really telling them that they don't really care about the future.
But it's because they got it's not that they don't care about the future. They care about the future so much they don't care about the now. But that's a different discussion. But my point is, they would, if Brian Bickle was a free agent, they might take a shot on him and see if they can flip him for something later. But at $4 million, they're not going to trade even a 7th round draft pick for him because they don't need that. and they're not going to get that in return later on. So there's not a lot of teams that are really going to, that off the top of my head, I can think will be just horrible next year and will really need to reach the cap floor. Maybe it'll be Arizona, but they're having a decent year this year, probably going to make the playoffs. So they're probably not going to be looking to take on an anchor contract like that. So the Hawks have basically two options. You can sit through the last year of Bickle's contract as the cap is expected to go down and let him eat the $4 million against your cap, or I guess it's $3 million if he's in the AHL. Or you buy him out and he's $1.33 million for 2 more years against the cap. And either way, it's a lose-lose because it's, you know, it's a $1.5 million, or $1.33 million of dead cap space for 2 years, or $4 million of dead cap space for 1 year. So it's basically a pick your poison. Which of the two evils is the lesser? And neither one is a good situation. And it's in some ways, like you look back at that 2013 playoffs that I referenced in, the contract that Bickle ended up getting, and it's almost like that contract almost has ended up hurting Brian Bickle's hockey career in that because of that contract, he's completely worthless. There's not a team in the NHL that values him, even the one he's playing for. And in some ways, in some ways, you almost feel bad for him there, where it's like, yeah, you know, I shouldn't even say feel bad, but because, you know, it's hard to feel bad for a guy making $4 million to be bad at hockey. But at the same time, you would hope that it would work out better than it has.
The worst thing to ever happen to the Taves Kane era / Bowman Hawks is worst and best thing is the birth of playoff Bickle, because it got you a Stanley Cup, and then he also had a nice 2014 run. And now they're tied down to him for the foreseeable future. And you, again, I mean, I don't know what they're gonna do with them. It's just something to speculate. If you had a prediction, what do you think happens? You mentioned those scenarios. There's really no. I mean, both are, like, as you mentioned, pretty bad. But there's lesser of two evils. But what do you think happens with Brian Bickle? Because at this point, I don't think he ever gets called up again unless there's some kind of significant injury to multiple forwards on the bottom six.
Yeah, I don't think he doesn't have a place on the Blackhawks, not this year anymore, and very unlikely that he'll have a place next year. You know, his agent said that they're open to a trade, which, welcome to the club. I don't really have an idea of what will happen. I have a what I hope will happen.
Give me your intuition.
I think, well, okay, the preference is you trade him for something. And if I had to pick something, I would say, okay, if you put 3 options in front of me and I had to pick one, I'd say trade him for a 7th-round pick and retain half his salary and move on. Like, just get it over with. Free up that $2 million of salary if you can. Or, just recoup whatever you can. But I think if I'm Stan Bowman, I'm buying out Brian Bickle, because he's not supposed, like, he should not be here anymore. If you keep him around on his contract, you're almost doing a disservice to him as well, because you're like, maybe there's a team out there that will give him an NHL shot at a cheaper contract, which, not that the Blackhawks need to be overly concerned with that, because it is a business. But if that aspect comes in, you can kind of consider it. I guess my point is just, he's worthless to you at $4 million. He's worthless to you at 1.3. So buy him out, let him sit, eat that $1.3 million for 2 years. That frees up $2.5 million in cap space that you can keep. You can only retain, half of his contract when he is, you can only retain half his deal if you trade him and retain salary. So if you buy him out, his cap hit goes down to 1/3 of what it is. So buy him out, free up that more cap space, deal with it for the extra year, and just be done with it. Move on.
And I hate to sound like such a meatball, but have you ever seen a 6'4", 230-pound guy just ever play so soft and not throw his weight around? This guy still tries to deke around, still tries to pull Patrick Kane and Taves moves with the puck, and then he loses it in classic Brian Bickle fashion so often whenever he actually does touch the puck. he's never adjusted just being that grinding guy that can open up space for the other people on his line. It's just so frustrating, like, that he hasn't adjusted his mentality, because we've seen him throw it on his rate. When we saw at the beginning of the playoffs last year, and this guy just, I mean, he's digging his own grave, because at $4 million, there's no way the Hawks still wouldn't want to trade him. But at least he could be viable if he actually tried to adjust his role to what his skill set actually is.
Right, and that's what I was gonna say. You kind of brought it up. Like he used to play that way. It's weird to see. I wonder if the only thing I can kind of think of is he has maybe some sort of injury, or maybe a head thing, like a head injury, where he just is a little more apprehensive towards physical. Yeah, he had the vertigo, so maybe he's a little more apprehensive towards physical play, and he is trying to avoid it. As much as he can. And like the thing is, like, he had success in the playoffs, and even in the regular seasons, he had some minor success. Was a pretty decent guy, could probably give you 10 goals a year because he played hard-nosed physical hockey. Now he doesn't play that anymore, and that's what's made him so worthless. And you watch him play, he's like, in a word, he is slow. He is slow with the puck, slow with his feet. He's slow to make decisions on passing or shooting. Like, he just is slow. He's not an NHL player anymore. If he, like you said, if he brought the physicality, he could potentially prove his worth at $4 million. If he could bring physicality to the table and play hard nosed, because he could probably, be that guy who raises hell against the other team and could still give you, somewhere between 10 and 15 goals. That's not necessarily, it's not ideal to pay that guy $4 million. But if he is living up to, if he's performing like even a middling NHL player, it's pretty worth having him on the roster, even if it is at a salary cap hit that's more than he deserves. But he's not doing that, and he's not even playing like an NHL player who deserves $500,000, let alone $4 million.
Oh man, this has probably been the most probably the most exhausting Hawks topic of the past, or one of the most exhausting Hawks topics in the past few years. I'm burned out. I don't feel bad for him, but I'm burned out. Bickle, man.
Yeah, I'm very surprised that they were unable to do anything with him in the summer. Like, it kind of blows my mind that Arizona was willing to take the contract of Chris Pronger, who is retired and in the Hockey Hall of Fame and working for the NHL, but still under contract somehow. They're willing to take that contract on, which that did give them some LTR, some long-term injured reserve cap space to work with, regardless. So that kind of helped them out a little bit. But it surprised me that they were willing to bring in that contract and not just eat Brian Bickle. But the issue is that's 2 years. If Bickle's contract hadn't been 4 years, then we're looking at a completely different thing here. I think if you look at it, more than the cap hit, more than the $4 million cap hit, what is really the bad part of Bickle's contract is the term. And that, people always say that term is what kills contracts, and term is the bad part of contracts more than annual salary. Because if you are paying a player too much money for too long, then that is what bites you in the ass more than paying him too much money for 2 years. If you paid a guy $10 million for 2 years, if he's not paying up to that, at least it's only 2 years. But Bickle at $4 million for 4 years, for the first 2 years, it was kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. This year, it's like, oh my God, this is so not worth it, and we're still stuck with it next year.
Yeah, let's move on, man. Let's move on. To someone that we should appreciate more often, but the Hawks blogosphere, we criticize him when need be. Joe Quenneville, you mentioned it, the second or maybe the best head coach in hockey. Just this past week, passed Al Arbor for second most wins in NHL history as a coach. But there just seems to be this underlying sentiment that for some reason Mike Babcock with his one Stanley Cup is somehow better, that Quenneville should be doing this with Kane, Taves, Hossa, Keith, Seabrook, and everybody else. And that Quenneville, I mean, he'll obviously still have his. I mean, Q obviously still have his moments where he benches two really good players. You saw it in the conference finals last year, Tavo and Vermette, and the Hawks lost that game. And you'll see him constantly go back to the blind blender and not really allow for any line chemistry. And it's frustrating for fans that watch every night and see what the team needs. But there's no one better that understands the pulse of this team. There's no one better that sort of is able to galvanize them. And even if they somehow maybe sometimes they win in spite of him, but more often than not, I mean, he's the guy that he's the leader. He's the perfect leader for this team. And I find it so funny that Hockey Canada still appreciates Babcock more, and I just can't understand why.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to it because I don't understand it either. I think sometimes using wins and Stanley Cups to sort of gauge, coaches and players as better than another is sort of pointless because it's more than just about, that the Stanley Cup part is the team aspect, but you're right. But for a coach, it definitely makes sense because he's the coach of the team. And you're right. Quenneville, has 3 Stanley Cups. Babcock only has 1. But I think like Quenneville and Babcock are such similar coaches. I think you hear a lot of the same criticisms for both of them they sort of ride certain players. They sort of pick out who they like and who they don't like. They're very defensive minded coaches and they have very similar reputations. They're both extremely well respected. And I think that in a lot of ways they're kind of a 1A and 1B, and just depends on which one you think is 1A. I don't know what it is that has made people appreciate Babcock more than Joel Quenneville. I have always sort of thought, like kind of what you said, like I've always sort of thought like, okay, yeah, Mike Babcock is a good coach, but like, why is he so good? Why is he the best? What makes him the best? And I've never really understood that whole draw. And I mean, if you look, as maybe you could say that over these past couple of years, Babcock didn't have as good of a group in Detroit as Quenneville has had in Chicago. But Datsuk and Zetterberg and company are, not, Datsuk and Zetterberg aren't far off of Kane and Taves. And in a lot of ways, they're maybe just as good in some certain areas. And so you look at that and you think, okay, like Babcock had a great team in Detroit too, but couldn't really make it click. But instead, Quenneville has had this sustained success. 4 Western Conference Finals in 6 years, 3 Stanley Cup championship appearances in 5 years, or 4 and 7, 3 and 6, and 3 Stanley Cups in those 6 years. It's like that sustained success and being the second most all-time winning coach. It's sort of like why isn't Quenneville sort of looked at in the same respect? But at the same time, it's almost like you don't really need him to be, because you still know that Quenneville is still just as good, maybe even better than Babcock. And so that reputation thing, it's maybe just more sort of hype than anything. But I also could just be a complete idiot, and there could be some reasons that I don't even understand as to why Babcock is appreciated and loved more than Quenneville.
It might be both.
Yeah, seriously.
You say 1A, 1B, and it's like people put Babcock in this whole different class. If we can't judge, listen, I know the 3 cups with a Z at the end isn't the best argument, but Quenneville is honestly, he's an old school guy. He's probably the best coach since Scotty Bowman. He's in success every year. Considering the Hawks cap situation, how he has to insert these young guys in, and he doesn't really succeed in getting them to play. But I mean, you saw how it worked with Tavo. You saw how it worked. It's working with Gustafsson. He somehow adjusts, and he's able to get this team to get 100 points. He's able to get this team to make a deep playoff run every year. That has to speak for something. It's not. A good team isn't just good or great team, because that's what the Blackhawks have been, isn't just great because of the talent they have. There has to be a leader pushing all the right buttons. And like you said, Babcock hasn't. I mean, he has Datsuk and Zetterberg, and hasn't had the best group in Detroit, but he hasn't necessarily been able to do that either because the Red Wings had all these fantastic prospects. They've had they were supposed to have a bright future while he was there, and that never really came to fruition until he left. And they're still sort of building towards that. I almost think that it's like Red Wing and Maple Leaf propaganda at this point, that two of the biggest hockey fan bases just sort of envelop everybody else. Oh, Mike Babcock is just a different class of coach or something. Like just a little meatballness. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think one thing that amplified it a lot more than you would think is the fact that Babcock became a free agent, if you will, and his contract ended with Detroit, and it was, where is he going to go? With Quenneville, you don't have that, and so with Babcock, there was a lot of hype around him because it's almost like this Stamkos thing this year. It's pretty comparable where, okay, he is the best coach that is going to be available on the market. And so you look at the Steven Stamkos thing. Steven Stamkos is the best player that's going to hit the open market in a long time. And so people are saying he could get the biggest contract of all time, and even bigger than the Kane and Taves deals. Is Stamkos really worth more than Kane and Taves? Maybe not, but he is going to be a restricted free agent. He's the biggest name to hit that market. So it's played up, it's amplified for sure. And I think that a Babcock kind of had that same effect where he hit the market. He signed that huge contract. I think he's making like $8 million a year to coach in Toronto. Like that plays a role, I think, because when there's able to be hype around a guy for a certain reason, it all just kind of gets played up. And I think also it's one of those things where the more something is said, the more it just becomes accepted. So people start saying Mike Babcock is the best coach in hockey. Mike Babcock is the best coach in hockey. Mike Babcock is the best coach in hockey. And people start to accept Mike Babcock is the best coach in hockey, even without argument. And maybe it's wrong, and right or wrong, it happens both ways.
As our final note of this Quenneville conversation, we have to mention that the Blues have had the 3 winningest coaches in NHL history and still have 0 Stanley Cups. So they can trade Robbie Fabry for Jonathan Drouin all they want. Let's quickly go around the West playoff picture and the Central. Obviously, the Hawks have sort of distinguished themselves in the past few days or the past few weeks with their winning streak and have caught Dallas. I mean, they caught Dallas a week ago. But as I'm looking at it, I mean, if we're talking about who are true cup contenders, if we're looking at matchups in the playoffs or teams that are on the fringe, I mean, I'm only afraid of the Kings at this point, even if they're in an awful division. The Pacific is a joke. I'm only afraid of the Kings that really stand in the way for the Hawks at this point. Everyone else in the Central has sort of fallen off, or Dallas has had a tailspin of late. St. Louis is St. Louis. I mean, are we ever going to be afraid of them? The Wild haven't improved at all. And I mean, in Nashville and Colorado, Nashville, I mean, they've been sucked by Rene, and Colorado is actually sort of surprised that they're even in a playoff spot at the moment. I think they are. They're the first wild card, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I mean, what stands out to you, Adam?
I think you hit it on the head where the only team that I'm concerned about, there are 2 teams that are going to be in the playoffs this year that I'm concerned about for the Blackhawks, and those are LA and Washington. So in the West, it's just LA. I don't think there's a team in the Central that's beating the Blackhawks 4 out of 7 games. Even Dallas, as much as people want to say Dallas is a real cup contender, I don't think they can beat the Blackhawks 4 out of 7. And that's the thing is, Dallas is maybe a cup contender, and one of the better teams if they don't have to run into the Blackhawks eventually, but they will because they're in their same division. There's not really a team in the division that can beat the Blackhawks 4 out of 7. The only team in the West that I think can do that is the Kings, and I don't even think that that's a lock. I think if the Blackhawks play the Kings, it's going to 7, in my opinion, and we're all gonna barf, cry, and die, as the saying goes. It's just that's gonna be hell because that's gonna be a war. That'll be a stressful 2 weeks, as it always is. And then if the Hawks get past that and they meet Washington in the finals. Braden Holtby is the best goalie in the NHL. I don't even think this is my hot take on Braden Holtby. I don't even think if Carey Price was playing this year, he'd be matching what Holtby's doing. Holtby is just on fire, and right behind him happens to just be Corey Crawford, ho hum. But but I think that Holtby and Ovechkin and their blue line has just they've been I didn't think that they would be as strong this year as they are Washington, but they have had a very good year, and so they're also a team that I think in a 7-game series has a good shot. I shouldn't say good shot, but has a shot at beating the Blackhawks in 4 of those games. And so I think that those are the 2 teams that Blackhawks fans need to be worried about, are facing LA or facing Washington in the playoffs.
The weirdest thing about this year, and as I look at the playoff picture, is that for everything the Blackhawks lost, sort of the reason why they've gone on this winning streak is obviously the kids have come to play, like Deneau and Gustafsson, but the rest of the league is pretty flawed. I mean, if you're looking at the point picture, and in that respect, I don't know if I can necessarily buy the Caps, man. I mean, I know they've been leading the league in points for most of the season now. They like you said, they have Holtby and they even have a few games in hand of the Hawks, and they're 5 points ahead of us. But this team just has something about them when they get in spring. We talk about how the Hawks rise to the occasion come playoff time and turn it up a notch. The Caps seem to do the opposite. They just have the choking gene in them. They're the St. Louis Blues of the Eastern Conference. And they've been the first seed before. They've had similar built teams like this before. I mean, they didn't have Justin Williams, necessarily a guy who's won cups and gritty series, but they're still similarly built. Their blue line isn't anything to sneeze at. I'm not sure if I'm necessarily afraid of the Caps. I think, in all respects, Blackhawks fans should really just be looking at as the LA and Chicago, which in all likelihood will be the Western Conference Final, is the real Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, and I think I was talking about that with a friend the other day. I have a friend who's a Kings fan, and we talked about that. How if you're the Eastern Conference and you look at Chicago, LA as the Western Conference Final, and you kind of go, well, shit, at least we got this far.
Yeah.
Because you're not like those 2 teams are just they're basically the class of the NHL. Don't matter with those 2, which not necessarily that they're worthless or whatever. So those teams still need to play well into the playoffs. Once the playoffs come, those are the 2 teams that, just as cliche as it is, they know how to win. They know how to get shit done come April, May, and June. And like I said, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's really not a cliche that you can just dismiss, because you have to teams that know how to win are the teams that win. And yeah, you have to be able to win to learn how to win. So Washington, like you said, isn't necessarily hasn't really learned how to win. But I think that when you look at the last time Washington was this good, it was 2010, and they won the President's Trophy that year. But they weren't built in the same way that they are this year, and they didn't have the best goalie in the NHL playing goalie for them then. And this year they do. This year they have Alex Ovechkin, who's tearing a hole through the league, just at almost at not at the rate of Patrick Kane, obviously, but playing extremely well. Nick Backstrom's playing extremely well. TJ Oshie's fit in well with that team. Justin Williams is fitting well with that team. They are clicking in a lot of ways that maybe wasn't expected, and so because of that, they are I think that if they end up in the Stanley Cup final against the Blackhawks or the Kings, then that is sort of a crapshoot where it's okay, this is going to be a really good series, because the Capitals, to me, watching the Capitals, which I'll admit I haven't done a whole lot of this year, but in what I've seen, they look like a team that is running similarly to the Blackhawks and the Kings in their style and their play, and sort of adding a little bit of just skill and finesse and playing that fast game, and they're doing a good job at it, and they're relying on their goaltender and their defense to push them forward, and they're letting their offense take care of business when necessary. And that's how the Blackhawks do it. That's how the Kings do it. And I think that because of that makes the Capitals real serious contenders and possibly a threat to the Hawks if that comes.
Can we agree that they're not the favorite, though? I mean,
definitely not
we could say that.
not the favorite. I would argue right now. I would argue that the Blackhawks are probably the favorite in the NHL, and not more than just bias. Obviously the Hawks can't keep up this hot streak, but they're hitting their stride, and a lot of the reason they're on this hot streak, kind of going back a little bit to what we talked about before, is the Taves and Hossa resurgence. Because those guys, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, where Taves and Hossa were shooting at career lows, just horribly low shooting percentages, almost laughably low, where you were looking at it and you were like, how is this even possible based on what they've done in the past? And they're regressing now towards where they're normally at, and that's really sparked them and the Blackhawks. And so if they can keep that up, where they're just kind of getting closer and closer and producing at their normal rate, then they will be, the Blackhawks should be the favorite going into the playoffs. But you still can't count the Kings. But I think between the two, between the Blackhawks and the Kings, I think they match up so evenly that it would come down to goaltending. And Corey Crawford has this year just been flat out better than John Quick, and that's why I think the Blackhawks have the edge there.
Yeah, people will tell you that somehow Quick is still better. I guarantee we'll hear that if the two meet in May, that Quick is somehow better. All right. Well, as our final note before we talk a little beer, I mean, let's look at the Hawks week ahead. 2-game road trip in Florida and Tampa, then a home game, last home game before the All-Star break against the Blues, and then last game before the All-Star break at Carolina. What do we think happens here? I mean, what are we watching for? Really,
Okay,
you could take this.
Here's my prediction, and then you can probably I'll let you state yours too. But I think that the Blackhawks, as is known to happen, will find a way to lose to Florida. Which that may sound sort of lame and like dissing on Florida, who's having a good year, but Florida this year is the PDO darlings, where they're kind of outperforming how good they should be. They went on that huge win streak that the Blackhawks have now matched. I think the Hawks are going to beat Tampa Bay, and then they're going to lose to Florida. And then that's really my only prediction. The rest of the week, I think that the game against the Blues will be an entertaining game. Is this the first time that the Hawks and Blues are playing again since the Hawks squandered that big lead and ended up losing 6-5 in that game? Have they played again since then?
No, I think this is the first game they played.
Yeah. So as long ago as that was, the Hawks might try to come back and say, okay, we're not letting that shit happen again. And so I think that'll be a fun game. It's always entertaining and fun to watch those teams get together and hate on the Blues and all their shitty players. And
all their unbelievably shitty players. If we're going to call out certain blogs, we won't name their name, but apparently they have more skilled players, and their depth players like David freaking Backus are better than our depth players. I don't know where that came from. We won't name the names of certain names, but it's just funny to me.
That was a ridiculous comment that I saw on Twitter, and we talked about. But yeah, I think that'll be a fun game, and then I think it's Carolina they play next week, and that's kind of whatever. And we get to the All-Star break, and that'll be a good time for the Hawks. I'm actually going to be in Nashville for the All-Star break with a press credential with SB Nation, so I'll get to hopefully talk to Kane and Taze while we're down there, and that'll be fun. And I think the All-Star break will be well welcomed by the Blackhawks and a little bit by the fans. The All-Star break is good for the fans too, where you kind of get that week-ish break from sort of the stress of being a hockey fan and watching games. And if at this point in time, it's a lot of fun because the Hawks are playing so well, but sometimes it can get a little tiring and stressful and emotional when your teams struggle and you start to feel the grind. And this is where you have to dig deep for the fandom in January. So the All-Star break is welcome.
I'll be the bold one, and I say they go into the All-Star break with a 16-game winning streak. I will take the reins, Adam, since you don't want to say anything. They're going to beat Tampa. They're going to beat Florida. They're going to beat the shit out of the Blues. Let's be honest. and then they're going to win on the road in Carolina. This team is rolling right now. At this point, they're going to finish January undefeated, and then we're going to see a few trademark 2 or 3 sleepwalking losses that'll have everybody going nuts on Twitter, everybody going nuts everywhere, and completely losing perspective because they've lost a few games in March after already having 90 points. I mean, we're already heading towards that. But this run doesn't end anytime soon, at least in my opinion. And I might be completely jinxing it, and they might get railed by Tampa tomorrow, but I don't see that happening.
Yeah, it'd be fun to go undefeated for all of January. Obviously, that'd be crazy to have an undefeated month. So hopefully they can pull it off. I think the reason that I think that they might lose to Florida is Florida. You look at you assume Scott Darling plays that game, backup goalie on the road, second night of a back-to-back, which you can say, okay, well, last week Darling played at the second night of a back-to-back against Toronto, but that's Toronto, and so don't even give me that argument because Toronto's horrible, as we talked about before. So Florida has a little bit more scoring punch. They have guys like Barkov and Huberdeau and Yager have been playing well, and Aaron Ekblad, who is just a freaking monster. So, Florida brings a little bit more, so I can kind of see where they might beat the Hawks. But, I hope you're right and I'm wrong, honestly.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Ekblad, basically the new Shea Weber, but more athletic and faster. So, I mean, that's probably the team that most scares me in the next 4 games. But I'm not worried. Yeah. I'm bold. I'm an asshole Hawks fan. I'm fine. I'm fine with that.
That's the hot take right there.
That's very hot. It's a very hot take. But we talked about this yesterday. Where do you guys? You've had Zombie Dust. If for those who aren't familiar that will be listening or that are listening, it's a beer and it's fantastic, and I can only find it on tap at like select locations. And
now we transition to the good part of the night. This is the good part of the night. This is more fun than the hockey talk. God, okay. I have not found Zombie Dust on tap anywhere. I've only ever had Zombie Dust in the bottle. And yeah, it's good. It's good. If you find it anywhere, you just need to get it. I don't care if you don't like. I don't even know if I would categorize it as an IPA. It's sort of like a off IPA where it's not super bitter or whatever. I don't care if you don't like it. If you try Zombie Dust, you will like Zombie Dust no matter what. It is just the best beer in existence currently.
Are you an IPA guy, or are you more partial to piss water, Miller Lights and Bud Lights?
Oh, I'm IPA pretty much through and through. Or basically just if it's craft beer, I'll drink it. I'm more of a light side guy. I don't like the darker beers as much, like porters and stuff and stouts. I tried this milk stout and I almost threw up one time. But I like the little lighter stuff, a little bit of hoppiness and kick to it. But if it's smooth, then I'll drink it.
Yeah, I've had Lagunitas. Have you had Lagunitas? To me,
yeah.
That's fantastic.
That's good stuff.
It's good stuff, and you can find it anywhere. I'm like more of a, not to sound girly and not to sound that's a stereotype or anything or a bad stereotype, but I love hard cider, man. That's probably my favorite alcoholic beverage. I mean, it's fantastic. It's sugary goodness. It's like a juice box, but with an alcoholic kick. It takes me back, man. Johnny Appleseed, Strongbow, really anything, really any kind of cider I love. And IPAs too. That's why we talked about Zombie Dust, but yeah,
they're good. I mean, they're really good. But to talk about Zombie Dust is one of those things that you need. Like it's a
legendary beer. It's a legendary.
It is.
It's a legendary freaking beer, man.
And legendary is a good way to put it because it's almost like a thing of legends where I've talked about Zombie Dust infinitely more times than I've consumed Zombie Dust. I think I've had like 4 bottles of Zombie Dust in my whole life, and I've tried to find Zombie Dust like 800 times. There's actually a liquor store like 10 minutes from me that sells it, and they get it in every Tuesday. Like I've gone in there and they say, no, you need to come on Tuesday. And I have gone in there at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, and they're already out of Zombie Dust. Like people that like Zombie Dust are dedicated to the Zombie Dust, and you need to, if you ever find it, you need to get it. So listeners, if you find Zombie Dust, get Zombie Dust and save one for me. And
I mean,
you will be loved.
Just look at the 6-pack. I mean, it's like a or it's like the picture on it. It's like a skeletal king with the crown, and it's
Oh yeah.
so badass. And I actually really want one right now, and I'm kind of pissed. We started talking about it. Oh man.
Yeah. Look what you did. This is all your fault.
Either way,
We should do a beer podcast one day. We'll bring Satchel on here. He likes beer too.
well, Satchel apparently has like a beer guy, and apparently he's able to go in like, oh hey, you have that on hold for me, or I don't know if Satchel's a beer snob or something, because I've never heard of a beer guy before. That's because that sounds fantastic too. Someone that just
that sounds very good. Just to have someone kind of in the pocket.
have someone in the pocket for you. You give them a tip or something, and then they come in and they have everything ready for you. The whole the zombie does for you. We have Satchel on. He better show us.
He needs to give us the secrets.
Well, I think that should just about wrap it up. And you have anything else you want to add, Adam?
No, I think I'm good. This was fun. Hopefully we can make this regular thing and get some listeners. And yeah, this will be good, I think, for our listener and readership and commenters. Comment below.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone. That's Adam Hess. I'm Robert Zaglinski. This is the SCH Second City Hockey Ice Cold Podcast with Zigs and Hess. This is our, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, our pilot episode, something that we're looking to start doing every now and then, or every few weeks, or every week. We'll determine the schedule, but we'll definitely let you know. It's been fun. It's been real. Thanks for tuning in, guys. That's just about it.